our miniature photos trapped in the dark ages, lost to shadows and blurriness? Fear not! Salvation has arrived with Miniature Photography 101.
No!
Bid farewell to disasters.
I hate that guy. YMG of all people.
Welcome to Miniature Photography 101 with Mark Gunter Photography. I'm here to teach you how to take better pictures of your miniatures without going into a whole lot of technical detail. So we're going to start quick, simple, and easy and show you practical ways to get it done. This is a shape that we are going to name the exposure triangle. Before I get into detailing the parts of the exposure triangle, I do need to give you a definition for a photography term. This will pop up all throughout this video and others. In photography, we talk about a stop. A stop is very easily defined as a change in brightness recorded by the sensor or by the film if you're still shooting with a film camera. So, if you are asked to stop up, what you're going to do is change a setting on your camera that doubles the exposure or brightens the image as it is recorded on the sensor. Stopping down, you're cutting the brightness in half. So you're doing something to make the image a little darker. With the exposure triangle, once you have a good exposure, but maybe you want a different effect, which we will get into in some detail, you will find yourself doing this equal but opposite exchange where you're going to use one tool to get brighter and another tool to balance it out by going darker so that your exposure is still the same overall. The first part of the exposure triangle, in the old days you'd pop a roll of 100, 200, 400 film into your camera depending on what you were going to shoot. That is now called ISO. It is the same as a film speed. It is the sensor sensitivity to light. So a camera will have a native ISO. That is the point at which it takes the cleanest photograph. So for my cameras, the native ISO has always been 100. There are some models out there that are native at 200. But if I start out at 100 as my native ISO, and that's what I have my camera set at, I can stop up to 200 and get twice the light recorded onto my sensor. I can brighten that image. And I can continue to brighten that image quite a ways up these days. Cameras have greatly improved over the last 15, 20 years in terms of quality that they can capture just with the ISO. Well, the thing with ISO, the reason that I say it has improved, is that at your camera's native level, that image is as good as it can be on that sensor. But as you step up, and you continue to step up, every step, you're adding just a little bit of what's called luminance noise to the image. On older cameras that I've worked with, by the time I got up to 800 ISO, which is only 3 stops, I would start to see little red and green dots on my image. And going up to 6400, it would be so noisy as to be not a good picture at all, not something you'd want to share. These days, my current camera, I can go up to 3200 and even 6400 and feel pretty good. It's a fairly clean image, and with tools, you can remove a lot of that. But as a general rule of thumb, ISO is the one side of this triangle that I do my best not to touch unless I have a very specific reason for it. I want a nice clean image, and if I can make the image at ISO 100, I will. The second side of the triangle is shutter speed. This is very simple as well. It's the length of time that the film or sensor is exposed to light. The shutter is literally a curtain, whether it's physical or digital. It is a curtain that protects the sensor or the film from the light. It covers it up. When you hit the shutter button on your camera, that shutter, digital or otherwise, moves out of the way, allows light to hit the sensor so the sensor can record the image. The amount of time that shutter is out of the way determines a couple of things. So if I'm at 1/250th of a second and I've got an ostrich running by, I have a pretty good chance of getting a pretty sharp image of that ostrich, unless he's really super close. But if my shutter speed is set at a half second, I'm going to get a blur instead of a good picture of an ostrich. Now, if you're taking pictures of moving things, this is a big deal. We're talking miniatures. If your miniatures are moving, then you probably should put the dog in a pen until you get the picture taken. Or talk to the USGS about their earthquake studies. Whatever the case, your model shouldn't be moving, and neither should your camera. One of the first things you should do is invest in a tripod or a sturdy stack of books that can hold your camera in place firmly so that it's not moving. You can hand hold a camera up to a point and get a solid image, but at the speeds that we're probably going to be using to get a good picture of a miniature, and with other factors involved, you're going to want it on a tripod. 1/250th of a second doesn't just stop the speed. It also has less light than 1/125th of a second or 1/60th of a second. It's the same thing. Shutter speed controls that amount of light. Our third and final, and in my opinion the most important part of the triangle for miniature photography, is aperture. Aperture refers to the opening in the lens that allows the light to come into the camera. The light will go through that aperture, the shutter will open up, the light will go through the shutter and hit the sensor. The wider the aperture, the more light gets in. The smaller the aperture, the less light gets in. So at an f/22, we call that an f-stop. At f/22, you're getting a darker image than you would at f/2.8, which would be a rather bright image, or it would allow one, because you have to remember these are always in relation to the other two sides. Aperture controls more than just how much light gets in. Just like ISO controls how much noise is on the image, shutter speed can control motion in the image. Aperture controls not just the light, but also your depth of field. And for miniature photography, depth of field is of great importance. Think of depth of field as the distance from you at which the scene gets sharp and in focus, and how far from that point it remains in focus. A narrow depth of field might mean that there's only an inch of your subject ahead of you that's in focus. A wide depth of field could mean everything in the picture is in focus. Okay, so we've covered the exposure triangle and how you have to balance the three sides out to get the right effect, not just the right exposure. So let's say you've got your camera exposed properly for the image. Your meter is showing its dead center. So you've got the right amount of light to capture a good picture. But you need to worry as well about depth of field to make sure that the entire miniature is in the area where it will also be completely in focus. You don't need the background in focus, you don't need anything else in focus, but you need that entire miniature in focus. In fact, usually you don't want the background in focus. It becomes a distraction. So if you've got the 28mm lens and your camera is set about 2 feet away from your subject and your aperture is f8, that means that you've got about 3¼ inches of depth of field. That should be plenty for most miniatures. Now, how do I know this? You can go online, you can do some searches for depth of field calculators. You can tell it, I'm using this lens, some of them will even ask you what camera, and my subject is this far away from my lens, and it will give you exactly what the depth of field will be based on your aperture. Or you can be lazy about it. If your entire miniature is not in focus when you take a picture, increase the aperture. Or If that's not really an option, or if you're like me and you just prefer to stay at f8, f11 because it's predictable that you will not get any of the background in the shot, you can move back. Physically move the camera backwards. Because if you take that same 28 millimeter lens and you move it back just a couple of inches, you'll get more depth of field, and it may be exactly what you need. Now, if you're using a longer lens, like say a 100 millimeter lens, from 2 feet away, you're only going to get a fifth of an inch or 0.5 centimeters of depth of field. That means a miniature on a 1-inch base, you're only getting 1/5 of it in focus. That's not nearly enough. On 100 millimeters, you can't do it from 2 feet. You have to go back to 4 foot to get at least 1 inch of depth of field. And as you move further back, you'll get a little bit more depth of field. So sometimes you have to really pay attention to where your camera is positioned in relation to the model. Okay, one more quick tip before we go. There's another way to gain light. Simply move the light you have closer to the miniature. There's a concept called the inner square law. What that says is that if you take a light and you have the distance between the light and the subject, you will double the amount of light on that subject. It's that simple. It's just another photography stop. But instead of doing it in the camera, you're moving the light closer. So now we have actually 4 ways to stop up or stop down. We can change our ISO, which again, that's the last thing I do. You can change your shutter speed. Go with a faster shutter speed for a darker image, a slower shutter speed for a brighter image. Or change your aperture, a wider aperture for a brighter image, but less depth of field, or a very narrow aperture for a darker image, but an immensely deep depth of field, which at f22 will get you almost everything sharp in the image. Or you can simply move your lights. Move them closer or to brighten it, move it further back to darken it. And it happens really quick. It doesn't take a whole lot of movement. And with that, we've covered the exposure triangle, how to adjust things in camera, how to use that knowledge of the exposure triangle to even things out. All right, that concludes this episode of Miniature Photography 101. Go out with your knowledge of the exposure triangle, give it a shot, test it out, see what you like, see what works best for you in your situation. And in the future, we will do a walkthrough of an actual photo shoot, and I'll let you see through my camera how I shoot. Until then, see you next time.